Something horrific was about to happen that day in Grand Haven, Michigan. Something very dark and sinister was happening beneath the surface that literally no one saw coming. When analyzing high-profile cases of familial annihilation, there is a silent progression from control to a total family destruction. It's almost always a silent and slow progression, and it's a complete shock to the community. As a licensed professional counselor, I look for specific behavioral markers that end in this type of tragedy. As you can see on this clinical file, these markers are almost always present in this exact order. Phase 1 is a long-term incipient trauma, coercive control, and strategic isolation. Phase 2 is the narcissistic injury. It's the identity fusion and loss of ownership. And then it goes to phase 3, the warning signs. Most of the time, people don't catch these signs. They're a sudden settlement of old affairs or speaking about the family in the past tense. And then phase 4, the internal shift. The mind shifts to an all or nothing thinking, viewing destruction actually as a merciful act of preservation. Look at this family right here. It looks like an absolute picture of suburban peace, doesn't it? Normal family. You look at a photo like this and you see, well, safety, security. You see a father, a mother, and happy kids, 6 of them, full house. But on July 24, 2026 in Grand Haven, Michigan, that peace, that family shattered in the most horrific, unimaginable way possible. So many people will look at a tragedy like this and they instantly see an incomprehensible act of pure malice. They see a heartless, unhinged, evil man. And you can understand why because of what he did to his family. Kris Karolkiewicz, which is the dad in this photo, took the lives of his wife and his 6 children before ending his own life. Today, we're using a clinical lens to look at the Kris Karolkiewicz case in this complex, heavy psychology of familial annihilation. People will focus on the dad, Kris, and look at what he did and wonder why he would do such a horrible and unimaginable act. And make no mistake, this is an absolute tragedy. It's horrible. But I'm taking a little different approach with this clinical file. I'm looking at the deep clinical explanation of the why. How does a father and husband, how does someone actually go from building a life with his family, day in and day out, doing the normal routine things with a full house, and then suddenly taking it all away in a single night? What's the mystery that we're going to solve? It's what I call the silent escalation. It's the quiet erosion of a person's coping mechanisms. But there's one specific cognitive bias happening here that almost everyone is missing. And trust me, it's a doozy. And I'm going to break that down in just a minute. But first, we're going to look at this differently. Standard true crime documentaries of this case almost always focuses entirely on the shock of the crime scene, the timeline, and the details of the tragedy. Makes sense. People want to know. That's not where I'm going to bring us today. Bring up graphic 5. As a clinician, I see a massive gaping chasm between that happy public presentation and the intense boiling internal pressure cooker that was building behind closed doors. The human mind doesn't just transition from a loving father to a predator without a psychological trail of breadcrumbs. The illusion of normalcy almost always starts with a confirmation bias. We see a nice-looking family in a nice-looking neighborhood, and we think they must be stable, like every other family in a neighborhood. But what's not seen is that invisible pressure cooker getting ready to explode. I know this is a lot to take in already. This is a very heavy case. So let's take a breath together for a second And let's look at why this actually matters for you in your own day-to-day life and for me. We need to just take a second to grasp the gravity of this situation. If you need a break, take a break. But I'm not going to go into the gory details here. You can look at that somewhere else. I'm going to look at the why. It's about recognizing the hidden dynamics. We aren't just retelling a sad story. We're trying to understand the human behavior so we can protect ourselves and the people we love. As a licensed professional counselor, when I look at the public facade of Kris, I don't see a sudden random snap. I see a devastating slow motion example of narcissistic collapse. Today, we're going to peel back this carefully constructed mask of the devoted family man and see exactly where the psychological warning signs were hiding all along. By the end of this video, you'll know the subtle psychological red flags that even the most calculated individuals can't hide. Skills that you can use to spot the deep-seated distress, control, or manipulation in your own life. Because if we can understand the mechanics of coercive control and pathological projection, we can better protect our own boundaries. For those of you who don't know me yet, I'm John Cordray. I'm an LPC. That's a licensed professional counselor. I've been a licensed therapist since 2007. And everything that I say in this video is my speculation. It's based on public records and the behaviors that I observe and the information that I receive. It's not a formal diagnosis, though, of anyone involved in this case. Hey, friends, if you want to keep unpacking these complex psychological cases with me, make sure to karate chop that subscribe button. Okay, so let's dive right into Kris's clinical file. Let's transition into the actual timeline. I think it's going to be helpful here. How did we get to July 24th, 2026? What was happening in the months, the weeks, and the days leading up to that fateful night? To understand this tragic ending, we have to look at the beginning. We have to map out the quiet warning signs, the history of their relationship, Kris and his wife, and the psychological architecture of their daily life. So let's step into this case and unpack the context that set the stage for this tragic ending. On July 24, 2026, police in Grand Haven, Michigan discovered a devastating scene. Kris had taken the lives of his wife and their 6 children before ending his own life. Honestly, when I first talked about this case with someone a few weeks ago about the timeline of this case and what happened and how many kids were involved, it just felt so heavy. I had to question myself, do I really want to do a clinical breakdown of this case because it's so tragic? It might cause a lot of triggers in people. But then I thought, well, no, I need to talk about this because it happens more often than you might think. Even though it doesn't make sense, you have the quiet, scenic lakeside community, and then just like that, this complete unspeakable tragedy happened. It doesn't make sense, does it? It's hard to wrap our minds around. But as a therapist, I have to look past the immediate shock and to really understand how someone reaches a point of such total catastrophic collapse. We have to look at what we call the developmental blueprint. Pull up graphic 7 here. None of us just wake up one day and decide to destroy everything we've built, to destroy our entire family. The blueprint in this psychological foundation, it's the early environmental conditioning, the coping mechanisms, and the deep-seated beliefs about power and relationships that a person develops over a lifetime. And in this specific blueprint, we see the dark, slow-burning presence of coercive control. Now, when most people hear the word abuse, they immediately think of physical violence. But coercive control is different. It's a strategic, almost invisible pattern of behavior where one person seeks to micro-regulate, isolate, and dominate every single aspect of their partner's life. It's about monitoring text messages, cutting off support systems, and slowly eroding the victim's sense of independence. And in this specific blueprint, we see the dark, slow-burning presence of that coercive control happening. This isn't a sudden explosion. He didn't just snap. It's what I call an incipient trauma, a slow, insidious buildup, where the environment changes so gradually that the victim doesn't even realize the temperature is rising until it is already boiling. Think about it like this. If someone comes into your life and tries to control you one day, suddenly, you run, right? But if they do it over 5 years, if they slowly, microscopic piece by microscopic piece, make themselves the center of your entire universe, your brain adapts. You normalize the abnormal. This is the boiling frog syndrome of psychological abuse. I'm sure you know about the boiling frog analogy. In Kris's developmental blueprint, his desperate need to be the absolute author of his family's reality meant that any sign of independent growth from Amanda or the kids was treated as a direct, hostile threat to his existence. He wasn't just trying to win arguments. He was fighting to keep his entire psychological structure from collapsing. And that brings us to a terrifying question. What happens when a person like this realizes they can no longer maintain the illusion? What do they do when the stage they built starts crumbling beneath their feet? If we go deeper into the clinical literature, criminologists actually have a name for this specific profile. It's called the anomic family annihilator. Sounds like Terminator, doesn't it? Sounds sci-fi-ish. When I started to look at this concept in this case, it sent a shiver down my spine. An anomic individual doesn't just see their family as loved ones. They see them as a trophy of their own success. If the trophy is about to be taken away, or if they can no longer maintain the illusion of having it all, their mind chooses to shatter the trophy rather than let anyone else see it broken. It's a terrifying level of objectification. And this is where we have to look at a highly misunderstood but deeply tragic dynamic. It's called pathological altruism. In healthy relationships, altruism is a beautiful thing. It's about giving to others, it's protecting them, and selfishly supporting the people we love. You and I do this every day. But in a highly distorted, narcissistic psyche, it can twist into a dark savior complex. When a controlling individual world begins to crumble under the weight of financial ruin or a looming divorce, they don't just experience panic. They experience an overwhelming need to control the narrative of how they are remembered. Their ego simply can't survive being seen as a failure. So how does the mind resolve this? It bends reality. They convince themselves that they're the only ones who could truly shield their family from the pain, shame, and suffering of the impending collapse. Clinically, we call this a catastrophic cognitive distortion. Instead of seeing their actions as an act of ultimate destruction, their mind reframes the horror as a tragic but necessary act of mercy. Yeah. To the outside observer, it looks like a sudden, inexplicit act of pure malice. But clinically, it's a culmination of months, and sometimes years, of a quietly developing savior complex gone completely wrong, off the rails. Kris chose to end the story on his own terms, casting himself not as the villain who failed to keep his life together, but as a tragic protector who spared his family from the harsh realities of a world he could no longer control. Wow. This is the ultimate devastating paradox of the pathological control. The perpetrator destroys the very thing they claim they want to protect, all to keep their own fragile ego intact. I know that this is really incredibly heavy here. It's unimaginable to think about. So let's pause again. Let's take a breath to slow things down a little bit. If you ever felt that you were walking on eggshells in your own home, or if you ever known someone who seemed to slowly disappear after getting into a relationship, then you know how exhausting that invisible weight is. It matters because understanding these patterns is how we recognize them in our own world. In many of these tragic cases, and unfortunately, there are a lot of them, more than you realize, the perpetrator's entire sense of self-worth is dangerously tied to this dominant, controlling role. It's what we call the identity fusion. They don't just have a family. They believe they own the family. It literally becomes sovereign lives versus identity fusion. Healthy boundaries have clear, distinct identities. I am me, and you are you. Individuals have independent futures and their own sovereign feelings. But identity fusion happens when it becomes psychological enmeshment. Their spouse and children are treated as mere extensions of their... So what happens when that control is threatened? Whether it's an impending separation or financial pressure, or maybe it's marital conflict, any threat to that domestic dominance triggers a profound narcissistic injury. Pull up graphic 19. When a fragile ego experiences a severe narcissistic injury, it doesn't just bruise, it fractures. They experience an overwhelming rush of shame and powerlessness, which in their mind that simply cannot process. But here is where the psychological mystery deepens even more. Most people assume that financial ruin or a looming divorce is what directly causes the snap. But clinically, we know that thousands of people go through divorces and bankruptcies every single day without ever resorting to violence. Thank goodness. So, what was the actual catalyst here? What was the specific hidden shift in Kris's psychological state that turned a desire for control into a desire for total destruction? There's a highly specific, terrifying behavioral shift that investigators often look for. A warning sign that almost always goes unnoticed until it's far too late. To understand how this internal collapse translated into outward actions on that summer night, we have to look closely at the behavioral timeline. Let's step into the next phase and break down the active warning signs, the psychological breakdown, and the exact moments the mask began to slip. We need to talk about what actually happens in the mind during the quiet, dark buildup to a tragedy like this. The act of familicide is quite rare. It's hardly ever this spontaneous or impulsive explosion that people think it is. It's just not. In my years of clinical practice, I've analyzed how individuals handle extreme crushing stress, and there's almost always a slow, agonizing progression. It's preceded by what we clinicians call the perceived loss of ownership. Let's look at graphic 13 here. In identity fusion, his family weren't viewed as independent individuals with their own sovereign lives or feelings or futures. They were really seen as extensions of his own ego. His identity was completely fused with them. Clinically, we call this extreme psychological enmeshment, like I talked about earlier. In a healthy family, we have boundaries. But in a highly enmeshed and pathological system, those boundaries are dissolving little by little until it's too late. In Kris's mind, if he was going down, his family had to go down with him because to his distorted psyche, they weren't separate human beings. They were part of his own skin, literally. And when you think about it that way, the tragedy becomes even more horrifying. Now, I know the word like ownership. It sounds incredibly cold and sterile when we're talking about a family. But we have to look at this through his eyes. In Kris's mind, his wife, Amanda, and their children were literally seen as a part of his own identity. If he was going to do something to him physically, then he had to do something in his mind to everyone else. His identity was completely fused with his family. So when a person carrying a severe hidden personality pathology starts to feel their grasp on that identity slipping, they don't look inward. Their ego won't let them. Instead, they resort to externalization of blame. Bring up graphic 20 here. It's this incredibly dangerous psychological defense mechanism where a person completely rejects any personal responsibility. They convince themselves, I'm not the failure here. They are. The world is. Instead of facing their own shame, their own cracking reality, their mind goes through a process of cognitive restructuring. They twist the narrative in their own head, distorting reality until ending everything. And I mean everything. It actually starts to look like the only logical resolution left on the table for them. It's a desperate, terrifying attempt to regain absolute control over a story they feel like they're losing. This part of the clinical file here of Kris and his family is incredibly heavy to think about. Let's just step back for a second. I know this is intense, but sitting with this uncomfortable truth is how we actually learn to see the patterns before they shatter lives. It's important. And this brings us right back to that concept that I talked about earlier. The psychological trap that we all fall into. It's what I call the illusion of normalcy. We look at a family living in a beautiful Grand Haven neighborhood, smiling in photos, and our brains instantly assume they look nice, they're safe, they're okay. Why? Why do we assume that? Because of confirmation bias. We see outwardly a stable family. It's a nice house, a quiet street. They all look fairly nice and happy in the photos. And then we project internal mental health onto the people inside. They all must be living the life. But a desperate, fracturing mind is capable of maintaining an unbelievable level of compartmentalization right up until the very last second. They can go to work, make small talk with the neighbors, mow the grass, pack school lunches, all while harboring a dark, destructive reality, a completely separate room of their mind. And this brings us to one of the most critical concepts in threat assessment, behavioral leakage. Bring up graphic 24. When a person is harboring a dark, destructive plan, they almost always leak their intentions. It's rarely an explicit, obvious threat. Instead, it's microscopic. It's the subtle shifts of an unexplained settlement of old affairs. It's a bizarre shift in how they talk about their future, maybe even speaking of their family in a past tense, or making comments about peace that sounds a little bit too final. Clinically, this is a mind trying to reconcile the massive, unbearable gap between the public mask and the private, impending horror. It's a state of extreme cognitive overload. They're exerting so much mental energy to keep the secret locked away that their normal social filters begin to fray at the edges. If you know what to look for, these tiny fractures in their daily routine are actually screaming for attention. But because we're hardwired to look for the good in people, at least most of us believe the good in people, we sweep these anomalies under the rug. We tell ourselves we're just imagining things. Maybe it's just me. But in reality, we're looking at the final desperate signals of a mind preparing to pull the trigger on its own existence and its own family. In these extreme desperate states, the perpetrator often rationalizes their thoughts through what we call altruistic homicide. Altruistic homicide. They don't seem to go together. But it's a deeply warped, terrifying belief where the person convinces themselves that they are actually saving their family from the cruel, painful world or from the perceived shame of a crumbling life. And to keep this fragile psychological homeostasis intact, He maintained that public mask, hiding the boiling resentment and panic underneath. But what allows a mind to make that final leap to violence? It's a defense mechanism called splitting. In psychology, splitting is an absolute all or nothing thinking. When stress hits a critical mass, a person loses the ability to see the gray areas. Their life is either 100% perfect or they are 100% ruined. There is no middle ground, no room for compromise, and no hope for recovery. Once his mind slipped into splitting, the future was painted in pitch black, making destruction look like a twisted act of preservation. But here's the thing you probably haven't even thought about yet. How do we tell the difference between someone who is just having a bad month or a bad day and someone whose psychological foundation is actively collapsing into a crisis right in front of you? And this brings us right back to the psychological bias that we tend to fall into. It's called the illusion of normalcy, I talked about earlier. We assume that because someone looks stable, the lives in a nice-looking Grand Haven neighborhood, and the smiles on the family photos. But a desperate mind can maintain an incredible facade right up until the final moment. Next, we need to talk about those final shifts in communication and behavior that occurred just before the major crisis. Ultimately, we step back from the raw grief and shock of this tragedy. We have to ask ourselves, what is a deeper lesson here? What does the tragic story of Kris's family teach us about the darker corners of human psychology? This tragedy shows us that extreme control and isolation are not just relationship red flags. They're profound, ticking psychological emergencies. It's so easy for us to look at relationship dynamics in people and in this family and think, well, they just argue a lot. Or, yeah, he's just a bit overprotective. But clinically, there's a massive difference between a difficult relationship and a system of coercive control. True prevention starts with recognizing when someone is trying to completely dominate another person's reality. When a person systematically cuts off their partner's access to friends or family and support networks, they're creating a state of psychological isolation. In this dark state, the victim's sense of self is slowly eroded. They begin to doubt their own memory, their own judgment, and their own values. This is the core of narcissistic abuse, and it operates like a slow, invisible poison. When I talk to clients who have survived these environments, they often describe this overwhelming feeling of being completely trapped in a reality that isn't theirs anymore. Their partner has rewritten the rules of what is normal or what is acceptable and what is safe. And this is why we have to shift how we look at relationship distress. We absolutely cannot afford to wait for physical violence before we take control and isolation seriously. By the time physical violence occurs, or by the time a devastating crisis unfolds, the psychological trap has already been fully sprung open. But why is it so hard to see these warning signs from the outside? It often goes back to that cognitive dissonance. As friends, family, and neighbors, we desperately want to believe that the people we care about are safe. We see a partner who seems slightly too involved in their spouse's schedule, or who makes subtle, undermining comments under the guise of caring for them. Our brains try to rationalize it. We tell ourselves they're just worried about her, or they're just going through a rough patch. This rationalization is a protective mechanism for our own minds, but it keeps us from seeing the unfolding relational trauma right in front of us. As a therapist, I spent decades helping people untangle these exact webs. And if there's one thing I want you to take away from this analysis, it's that we have to become comfortable with looking beneath the surface. Not to judge, not to expect or suspect, but we have to learn to trust our intuition and our gut feelings when something feels a little off in a dynamic. There's one more piece to this psychological puzzle that we absolutely have to address here. It's what I call relational agency, our own collective power to step in and disrupt these cycles of isolation. Often, when we see a family struggling or notice those subtle, quiet warning signs, we hesitate. We feel awkward, and then we fall into a victim bystander effect, telling ourselves it's a private family matter. They'll work it out. Or I don't want to overstep my bounds and make things worse. Have you ever thought that yourself? But we have to realize that pathological control and isolation thrive in silence. In a system of coercive control, the perpetrator relies almost entirely on the privacy of the home to maintain their complete dominance over their partner's reality. And when we stay silent or look the other way out of politeness, or we convince ourselves it's nothing, we unintentionally reinforce that isolation. That's heavy to think about. But building relational agency means having the courage to ask the hard questions, to check in with someone who seems to be withdrawing, and to offer a safe, consistent space without judgment. It doesn't mean you have to act like a clinical therapist like me or solve the entire problem yourself. It just simply means being reliable and a grounding bridge. Sometimes just knowing that a neighbor or a friend or a coworker is paying attention, that they see through the polished mask, can crack the psychological prison of isolation and give a victim the strength they need to reach out for professional help. We can't prevent every single tragedy, but by reclaiming our relational agency, we can make it much harder for these silent pressure cookers to build up in the dark. If you see a friend who has suddenly stopped responding to text, or who cancels plans repeatedly, or who seems to constantly check in with their partner for permission to exist or to do something, don't just ignore it. Reach out. Let them know that they have an anchor outside of that isolating system. Because sometimes just knowing that one person sees through the illusion is enough to help a victim find their way back to solid ground and stand up for themselves. Systemic prevention isn't about solving every crisis perfectly. It's about breaking the silence in the isolation that allows these toxic dynamics to grow in the dark. We have to realize that the human mind is incredibly complex. People are capable of harboring immense distress, anger, and pathological control while presenting a perfectly polished, charming exterior to the outside world. It's a sobering reality, but it's one we have to face if we want to build a healthier, safer community. If you want to understand the deeper psychology behind why some people wear these dangerous masks and how they construct them and how they use them to slowly dismantle another person's reality, you definitely want to watch my next video on covert manipulation. When we look at the families around us or even our own, are we truly paying attention to the silent, heavy pressure building under the surface? Or are we choosing to see the happy pictures? That's something to think about. Welcome to After the Breakdown. This is where I talk more about the graphics, more of the mental health concepts, how it relates to the case, but also how it relates to everyday life, maybe yours. And so this is where I can expand a little more than what I did in the breakdown, because a lot of people have asked, can I talk more about the graphics? And that's what I'm doing right here. So that's After the Breakdown. It's more of a podcast style breakdown of the clinical files that we just talked about. So I wanted to really kind of talk a little bit about the context here. So the context where it happened was in Grand Haven, Michigan. Now, Grand Haven, Michigan is a beautiful place. If you've never been there, it's on the shores of Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan is blue. It is deep, dark blue, and it looks like an ocean because you can't really see the other side. And it's just water. It's beautiful. It's gorgeous. I've been there. Lots of people go for vacations. And so this is where the tragedy happened. It's more than tragedy, isn't it? It's heartbreaking. Kris, for whatever reason, we don't know. It hasn't been released yet. We don't know why Kris ended the lives of his family, shattered the lives of his family, and left behind so many other lives that are heartbroken. Grandparents, friends, aunts and uncles, possibly. But if you look at the picture of this family, of Kris and his wife, Amanda, and this happened in July of 2026, so recently. And it was a beautiful day. Summer in Michigan is usually, 75, maybe 80 degrees in the day, and chilly in the mornings, chilly in the evenings. Gorgeous. And so his wife, Amanda, she went by Mandy, and their 6 kids. There's a lot of kids. I mean, they're beautiful kids. Look at them. And there were 2 girls that they adopted as well. And so on the outside, it seemed like they had it all together. They're happy. They even adopted. They expanded their family. And then all of a sudden, we get the news that Kris did this to his family and to himself. And if you look at Kris, he seemed like a normal guy. He doesn't look like an evil person, doesn't look like a killer, does he? No, he looks like a normal guy. Looks like he's happy for the most part. He's smiling in these pictures. And we do know something I didn't mention earlier about Kris. Kris had a job. He worked remotely from home. And it looks like he recently lost his job. And losing a job is horrifying for a parent who has a lot of kids to feed, a lot of mouths to feed, and mortgages to pay. We don't know yet if that was the sole reason for this, but we know that he lost his job in July, and he did this in July. We know, now that we know as this has come out, there may have been some marital issues. And maybe, I think other people say that Kris may have had an affair. These are things that are slowly starting to come out, and the pieces are starting to come together. But the kids, there were 6 of them, and they were sweet kids. At least they look like sweet kids, right? And yet Kris one day decided to end everybody's life in that house, all in one swoop with a gun. And it's incomprehensible for us, but for Kris, in his mind, it made complete sense. Something terrible happened, and so I'm going to be the one in control of the rest of everyone else's destiny. And that's why I wanted to start with the anatomy of the silent escalation. It's silent. It's behind closed doors. It's behind the smiles that we see on the photos. And it starts with the long-term incipient trauma. That's that coercive control that started a long time ago. It wasn't sudden. And it tends to come up in little ways. Can't do that. You need to do this. And it might even been a polite way of controlling. And that's how it seeps into relationships. Sometimes it's not real obvious that it's control. And so it's incipient. And then that leads to the second phase, which is narcissistic injury. This is where the identity fusion and the loss of ownership started to crack for Kris. Couldn't take it. Something had to be done, and he had to be the one to do it. And then the phase 3, the third phase, these are the warning signs. This is learning to identify the behavioral leakage that I talked about. Behavioral leakage are the things that are subtle, but they're almost foreshadows of the things that they either have done or will do. And for Kris, it was collecting, maybe getting his affairs in order. It was speaking about family in a past tense. So in his mind, that he had already made up what he was going to do. And those little leakages come out with maybe some of his friends or colleagues or coworkers or neighbors, comes out in subtle ways that really nobody knows what's going to happen until after the fact. And then the fourth devastating phase is that internal shift. The internal shift is where he split in his internal narrative into a cognitive distortion of the worst case. And so you have this slow progression from phase one to long-term incipient trauma, history of corrosive control, leading all the way to the internal split. And that, in his mind, was the only answer. And it was a final answer. And so the autonomy of a collapse of the family is another term for it is familial annihilation. And it's completely annihilating your family. And in this case, it's a murder-suicide. And I went and looked about how often does this happen. I know it happens often, but I wasn't sure how often it happens. And there are two stats here that I looked up. One is what's the percentage of homicide that happens by a family member? And so I looked at the FBI data. This was last year's or 2025's data. 15.6% are slain by family members. That's staggering. Staggering. I've had clients who this has happened to. It happens more often than you think. And then I looked into familiar homicide. This is where a parent kills the child or the children in the family. And then it's murder-suicide when they put it on themselves. The staggering stat is 1,000 deaths annually. 1,000. In the U.S. That's just the U.S. 1,000. And yet, this is what I found, I think, even more shocking, is that there's no single comprehensive official national tracking system from either the FBI or the CDC specifically for murder-suicides. That blows my mind. So this is kind of an estimate. We don't have a way to track it. Why? Why not? It happens way more than you might realize, and so we need to be tracking this. We need to be addressing this. There's no reason why we don't have an official database here. All right, I'll get off my soapbox. So let's look at the illusion of normalcy. This is so important here because it happens with everybody. I mean, very minor, but it's still a part of that illusion of normalcy. Someone asks you how you're doing and you had a terrible day, but you don't want to say you have a terrible day. So what do? What do you say? I'm fine. And then you quickly divert it to a different topic. Or maybe you divert it to the other person. I'm fine. How are you? You want to do everything you can to act like everything's normal for whatever reason. But here in this family with Kris in Grand Haven, Michigan, on the outside, people thought they were a happy family. They live in the suburbs. They look normal. But what we don't know are the unknown variables that were happening underneath that iceberg of this family. And again, this happens everywhere. It's not just with this family. It doesn't always end, thank goodness, in this tragic way. But the illusion of normalcy is really with most people. And it kind of makes sense. So the illusion, though, the illusion part of it is what other people think. It's the confirmation bias, where you look at the family photo, you look at the house, you look at all the external things, and you think, well, there's a normal, happy family. They're an American family. They all are looking nice. They go to school, they do their things, and it's fine. They smile on the photos and probably on their social media. Sure, it looks fine. They end up doing their daily routines just like everyone else. That's confirmation bias, where people from looking at them assume that they have it all together. But what was actually happening was the pressure cooker in their life. Kris was compartmentalizing to the extreme. The boiling internal pressure was happening. Like I said, Kris lost his job. Then there's the unseen coercive control that was happening. And then the extreme cognitive overload. So you got 4 major things going on inside Kris's brain. The compartmentalizing, the boiling internal pressure going on with the marriage and with his job, losing his job. Then there's the unseen coercive control where he was saying these things and doing these things in his family. No one else knew about it. That's why it's coercive. That's why it's covert. And then the extreme cognitive overload, trying to carry all these things in your mind. And so you come to this total annihilation of your family as a total solution. The human mind just cannot transition from a loving father to a predator without a psychological trail of breadcrumbs. There are things that happen that now, retrospectively, we can see. We can see why, those breadcrumbs. But how does this apply to your life? How does confirmation apply to your life? How does the illusion of normalcy happen in your life? Some of you are living in an environment where there is coercive control going on, or maybe in the past. Some of you are struggling with a family member, and yet you don't want other people to know, and so you act like everything is normal. It's fine. And it's very much different in a way that it's not as tragic, but it's similar in some ways as well, where we want to hide things that we don't want other people to know. And so we act like everything's fine. What are you acting? How are you acting in your family and in your life? Are you acting under the illusion of normalcy? And then the transitioning from the shock to the clinical lens here. It is shocking, isn't it? The silent escalation, the coercive control, the pathological projection. I've talked about that in the breakdown. It is the iceberg. And we all know the iceberg analogy, right? Everything you see on top, but what you don't see, the massive presence underneath. And all of the things underneath is shielded by that illusion of normalcy. Trying to pretend that everything's fine when they're not fine. They're falling apart. And so the developmental blueprint of control here, and that's really what we're honing in on, is this element of control. And you become a prisoner in your own home. And that incipient trauma that I talked about, the slow little jabs, the preventing from going out, or who are you talking to? Give me your phone. And these indicators, these behaviors gradually wear on someone. But then they get used to it. And they kind of tell themselves this is the way it is. Maybe every marriage is like this. And so coercive control is actually a very strategic pattern. It goes from the micro-regulating, the micromanaging, to even down to the minute details of what they can eat or what they drink. Sometimes that's what happens. Or who they go out with and where they go. It's all controlled. To actually cutting off support systems. You can't go there. I'm not going to let you go to your friends. I'm not going to let you call your parents. And they twist it to make it the victim's fault, or make it seem like it's their fault. I'm doing this because I love you. I'm doing you a favor. I know better. And that incipient trauma one after another, the put downs and the abuse and the extreme controlling wears on somebody over time. It's like water dripping on a stone. Eventually, the ragged stone becomes smooth. And then eventually, it becomes erosion. And that's what incipient trauma does. It erodes your whole sense of self-worth. Some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. You've lived it. So the architecture of coercive control is the microregulation, what you can or can't do, the little things, right? The monitoring of schedules, the text messaging, give me your phone, right? Those are micro-regulation. And then there's the isolation. It's your good. It's for your good. You're going to stay home. You're not going to talk to your parents. And then there's complete domination, where the eroding of independence happens slowly, like the water on a rock. It erodes slowly. And then the victim's reality is no more theirs. Then there's no agency for them. And that is really, really sad in homes that have somebody in their home that has this incipient and coercive control. They will act like to everyone else. That's the thing. Everyone else thinks they're a good person, but on the inside, behind the doors, they are controlling. It's a lot like the analogy that I used in the breakdown about the boiling frog. You know that analogy, right? So when you put a frog in a pot, and then in the pot on the oven, and then you turn it on, the burner, and then the frog remains in the pot while the water boils. And it's so slow that they don't realize it's getting hot. And then eventually they're going to boil to death. But if you have the water already boiling and try to put the frog in, it's going to hop out. It's going to know that it's pain. And they're not going to stay or tolerate it. And that's what happens here. The slow burning effect of incipient trauma. It's the escalation of abuse. So if total control is attempted on day one, the victim runs, right? The water's boiling. You try to put it in the pot, you're out. It's very obvious. This is bad, danger, and you leave. But then there's the micro-regulation that I talked about. It's those microscopic pieces of independence that are systematically eroded, little by little. And then, guess who becomes the center of the universe? Yeah, the controller. The perpetrator makes themselves the absolute center of the victim's reality. They can't do anything without the observer. They can't do anything about, and they can't do anything on their own. They have to get permission from the person in the center of their universe. And then what happens, it becomes a normal, normalizing the abnormal. That's what is tragic here. All the little things, those micro-regulations, the belittling, to make you feel less than, to make you feel dependent on them. It becomes normal. It feels normal. Our brain adapts to it. The victim no longer realizes the psychological temperature has reached a boiling point. We don't realize it. We stay in the pot. And that's why so many people stay in an abusive relationship. They don't realize how bad it really is because they don't see it. They've been living in it for so long, it becomes normal. But other people see it. Your friends might see it. Your parents might see it. And they might say something to you. And before you deny it, I want you to think about this very, very carefully and ask yourself, am I in a relationship that is systematically tearing me down? Am I in this boiling pot of a relationship and I don't even realize it? So the incipient trauma and the boiling frog syndrome, they go together, don't they? The victim doesn't even realize how bad it really is until someone points it out to them. And even then, they'll deny it. A lot of times, I've seen this happen. People will deny that they're really in an abusive relationship. They'll deny that it's as bad as it really is. They want it to be normal, and they don't want to make it worse. So they're stuck. Here's the profile of the anomic annihilator. So the core trait here is a desperate need to be the absolute author of the family's reality. Kris had to be that person. He was the absolute alpha, if you want to use that term, of his family. Starts with objectification. Family members are not really viewed as sovereign lives with independent futures. They're viewed as trophies. I've had parents that viewed their kids as trophies, and they live vicariously through them. If they're in a sport, they better be the best one on the team, by golly. And if they're not, I'm going to let them know it. I'm going to make them feel bad so they'll improve. Objectification is a horrible thing to put on your kids or your spouse or your partner. But then there's a perception of threat. Any independent growth from the spouse or the children is a threat, as a direct, hostile threat to the perpetrator's existence. If they have their own life and their own independence and their own agency, that becomes a threat to them because they don't want to lose control. They don't want the spouse or the children to have their own independent lives and do their own independent things. And then, unfortunately, becomes the ultimate choice. If the trophy is about to be taken away, whether it's divorce, whether it's family ruin, or the family secret coming out, the mind chooses to shatter the trophy rather than let it see broken. That is tragic. So the anomic family annihilator profile is that the family is a trophy as long as they do what they're supposed to do, as long as it looks nice and shiny. So the perpetrator's ego and success is shining a spotlight so the community can look at that nice person, that nice dad, and think he is normal and a good dad. So family is a trophy of success. The mechanism will shatter the trophy rather than anyone else seeing any problem. And then the outcome is a destruction of the family to preserve the illusion of total control, which is wild. Wild to think about. To think that destroying your entire family and yourself is the only answer. But that's what happened. There's a threat of financial ruin and community perceptions, and he did not want that. And that leads us to identity fusion and the loss of ownership. For Kris, healthy boundaries did not exist in the home, because a healthy boundary is we're all individual people. We live under the same roof, but we're individual people. I'll do my thing, you do your thing, and then we'll do things together. We're different people. That's healthy boundaries. But psychological enmeshment that was happening in that home, that we know now, is that boundaries dissolved. The perpetrator begins threatening the family as mere extensions of their own ego. The psychological enmeshment, it's a trap, it's a net, and they can't get out. And then the total fusion, loss of ownership. When someone who is coercive and abusive loses ownership, then the people that they were owning are viewed as part of the perpetrator's own skin. like they're part of their own body, their own extension of who they are, their identity. If he goes down, they must all go down with him. It's the exact opposite of a ship, right? The ship is going down. Who's going to stay? The captain. Everyone else he's going to protect. Off the ship, I'm going down. I want to make a very clear distinction here. There are sovereign lives, and then there are identity fusion. The sovereign lives are I am me and you are you. We're individual people. We have agency. But the identity fusion is that enmeshment, psychological enmeshment. It's complete perceived ownership. You are no longer yourself. You are part of me. I own you. And they may not say that directly, but they certainly act like it. The family is viewed as literal extensions of the perpetrator's ego. And then there's the catalyst of the narcissistic collapse here. Threats to dominance, the impending separation. I think Amanda was getting ready to leave. Then there's the extreme financial pressure. Not only losing his job, but maybe he had a lot of debt as well. There's marital conflict going on. All of this was going on behind the family photos, which led to a narcissistic injury. The fragile ego experiences a severe, catastrophic injury. It's not just a bruise. It fractures under the overwhelming shame and powerlessness. So when the controller feels like they can't control anything, the only thing they can control, the only thing that's left, are lives, their own and their families. The psychological defense mechanism is the externalization of blame. The perpetrator completely rejects personal responsibility. The world and the victims become failure, not the perpetrator. You're the reason why I have to do this. Everyone's against me, and this is my only option. Do you see how that is twisted? Actually, it's splitting. So the splitting mechanism is either you're 100% maintained and have absolute control, or you're 100% ruined, have no control. The future is bleak. There is no future. No room for compromise and no hope for recovery. And when he believed that there was no hope for recovery, he did the ultimate act and destroyed himself and his family. When stress hits a critical mass, the perpetrator mind loses the ability to see any gray areas at all. This is absolute all or nothing, live or die thinking, and it makes total destruction look like a twisted act of preservation. Which leads to the paradox of the pathological altruism. Sounds oxymoron, doesn't it? It doesn't go together. Pathological and then altruism. So there is a healthy altruism. That's giving and protecting and selflessly supporting others. We do nice things. We volunteer to help. Maybe we give to a charity. We have protection. We have protective action. But then there's the pathological altruism. It's that dark savior complex. I've talked about this in some of my other videos. It's where the perpetrator bends reality and actually convinces themselves that they are the only one who could shield the family from the shame of a crumbling life. In his own twisted way, he felt like he was doing the right thing. Altruistic homicide is a catastrophic cognitive distortion. Catastrophic. The ultimate paradox is the perpetrator destroys the very thing that they claim to protect, solely to keep their own ego intact. Did you catch that? They claim to protect their family, but they're really protecting their own fragile ego. And this narcissistic injury triggers the fracture, the catalyst of impending separation and all the things that we did not know, and frankly, we probably don't know all the details of why this happened. The fragile ego and the domestic dominance is the impact of that severe narcissistic injury. It's the leakage of overwhelming rush of shame and powerlessness. So the illusion of normalcy in Kris was enormous. The behavioral leakage that I talked about earlier, it's about spotting the fractures, like the verbal shifts when he spoke of the family in the past tense, or maybe bizarre final sounding comments about peace, finally getting peace, or the extreme cognitive overload, the massive energy that's required to reconcile what you're about to do to your family that you claim to love. And then the danger, because these threats are so microscopic, they're not explicit. We often sweep these things under the rug. And that's what's sad. And that's, we do that, right? We can't go looking for every little thing under a rock and assume the worst. The cognitive restructuring and externalization of blame here. This is where Kris finally realized his personal failure, and it was shame. He felt extreme shame. And then the restructuring of his ego couldn't happen, and so it came apart. It shattered. The redirect that I'm not the failure, they are, was his tactic. The mechanism of complete rejection of personal responsibility to desperately regain that narrative control that he wanted so badly. This was the only action that he could take. It was a final action. So when you have somebody in your own life that's trying to restructure the whole system in the home, be careful and look for those leakages that I mentioned. The bystander trap and the cognitive dissonance here, there's a lesson here for all of us, whether you have someone who is abusive in your relationship or not. It's a lesson for all of us. We need to observe our friends. Look for these signs in our friends and family members and even co-workers. We want to witness an anomaly. When we see something, when we have that gut feeling that something seems off, we need to really think about that. We need to be able to say something, ask questions, be specific. Because it becomes a cognitive dissonance whenever we see something and we're trying to reconcile a disturbing observation that we're seeing with the nice neighborhood family that is projected. And we have that cognitive bias. Oh, well, maybe it was just a bad day. Maybe it was off. Maybe something else happened. We tend to rationalize it away. It's a protective mental reframing that we often do. They're just going through a rough patch. And then what happens? We go through this whole system of bystander trap. Then we don't do anything. That's the bystander effect, where silence is maintained under the guise of it's a private family member. It's kind of like what happens sometimes when there is an accident. Let's say it's in, a big populated city, maybe New York City. Someone falls down in the middle of everybody and they're hurt. Maybe they're having a heart attack. And everyone's watching. They form a big circle around the person on the ground that's having a heart attack. No one's doing anything. Why? Because of the bystander effect. Oh, I don't want to get involved. Oh, I don't want to hurt him. Oh, I don't know. Maybe it's something else. I don't know what to do. All these excuses. And so nobody does anything. Until someone says, hey, you in a red shirt, call 911. And then they'll do something. But the bystander effect is real. It happens a lot. And so the dark paradox of the pathological altruism that I talked about earlier, it's this diamond prism effect, the cognitive distortion prism. So the fracturing narcissistic psyche, and then the input, which is the reality of total destruction and loss of control. And then the prism itself is fracturing the narcissistic psyche. The altruistic homicide and savior complex is the part of this prism as well. Reframing the horror as a tragic but necessary act of mercy to spare the family from crumbling around them is a very, very distorted way of looking at this prism. It's a dark paradox of pathological altruism. It was so dark. Now, Kris on the outside was nice, I'm sure. Not this dark, evil person. But in his mind, this was happening. The relational agency is breaking the silence, doing something about it. The bystander, you see something, do something. You see something, say something. The bridge. You get the bystander and the bridge, which is the controller. And then on the other side of that bridge is the victim. But the antidote of relational agency is our collective power to do something, to disrupt it. And that's what somebody needs in their own life. A victim who has a relationship that's abusive is like the person on the ground who is having a heart attack and people around them are watching. But until someone says, hey, you in the red shirt, call 911, until then, nothing happens. But when that happens, when someone steps in and says something and takes action, something happens, and it's awesome. So, to protect those around you who may be in an abusive relationship, notice withdrawal, maybe canceling of plans, or checking in for permission to be able to go do something, or ask the hard questions without judgment. Hey, something going on here? Be honest. Or serve as a reliable, grounded bridge for that person. You don't need to be a clinical therapist like me. You don't have to be a therapist. But just be that anchor in their life. And don't just explain things away either. Dig a little deeper if you have to. So you want to detect the behavioral leakage. You want to look for the sudden shifts in behavior and the speaking of the family in past tense, and then fraying filters, the microscopic cracks in the daily routine. These are all part of the behavioral leakage. And by the way, this is very similar to someone who is attempting to end their own life. There's leakage. They give away things. They speak about life in past tense. Or they speak about peace. I'll finally get peace. That's leakage as well. You want to know what you're looking for and then do something about it. So the final cognitive collapse, you lost the ability, the tolerance for the gray areas. You could not see gray. And once the mind enters an all or nothing thinking, destruction looks like preservation. It's oxymoric. Most of us can't comprehend a person to think that way, or a dad or a husband to think that way. Either you're 100% perfect or you're 100% ruined. And for Kris, in his mind, the whole family was 100% ruined. So he needed to do something about it. So this is a stark reminder that this type of thing happens more than we realize. Abuse, domestic abuse happens way more than we realize. And we have to be able to spot the invisible pressure cooker that's happening. It's not always easy. And most of the time we want to believe that everybody is doing just fine. But when they're not, you can't ignore the signs and say something about it. Don't be a part of the bystander effect. Do something, say something about it. Take some action. Be that anchor for somebody. Maybe for your friend. Or maybe it's you. Maybe you're in an abusive relationship. Don't be afraid to ask for help. I know it seems impossible, but don't be the frog that's in the boiling pot and just sits there. I want you to realize how hot the water is in your life and get out. Ask for help. Seek help if you need to. Your agency, your individual agency is worth far more than anything else you can get. You are an individual person who deserves respect, love, and acceptance. Don't settle for anything less. Thank you so much for being a part of this. Thanks for watching the after the breakdown. This is great. I love being able to talk about this more. If this is something that you like, you want me to continue, keep telling me. I need the feedback. If I can tweak it a little bit, tell me. All right, so make sure you watch this next video, my next clinical breakdown. It has so many different psychological layers that I think you're going to find really intriguing right here.